The sun hung low over the small town of Glenmore, casting an amber hue across the steeple of the Church of New Light. The church, a modest whitewashed building with a blue roof and a hand-carved sign swaying gently in the spring wind, had long been the heart of this quiet community. For years, Pastor Elijah Merrin had stood behind the pulpit, delivering sermons with a calm authority that soothed and stirred in equal measure. His voice, deep and graveled from years of preaching and prayer, carried through the stained-glass sanctuary like a warm tide. Most Sundays, he spoke of love, forgiveness, and the quiet grace of redemption. He was loved, respected, and, in some quarters, revered. And that's why what happened after the service on the first Sunday of May shattered the town like a dropped mirror. The congregation had been larger than usual that morning. Rumors had been floating around for weeks, whispers at potlucks, murmurs during Wednesday Bible study, that something wasn't quite right at the church. No one wanted to say it outright, but it was there, lingering like a faint scent of smoke in a room. Pastor Merrin had dismissed the rumors with a gentle smile, telling his flock that the devil liked to sow doubt where faith bloomed, and the faithful had nodded, trusting him as they always had. But still, that morning, more people had shown up, drawn either by loyalty or suspicion, to see him speak. His sermon had been unusually impassioned. He spoke of trials and betrayals, of the weight of carrying burdens no one else could see. He looked more tired than usual, the creases under his eyes deeper, his gestures more restrained. The usual lilt in his voice was missing, replaced by something harder to place, a tension just under the surface, like a tight wire threatening to snap. He didn't linger after the final hymn. He offered a brief blessing and disappeared into his office, shutting the door behind him with an audible click. Outside, the congregation buzzed with questions. People stood in tight clusters, glancing toward the church, whispering among themselves. The town's older women, who usually stayed to tidy up the hymnals and polish the pews, left early, clutching their purses with tight lips. Even the children seemed quieter than usual, picking at the grass instead of playing tag. Then the police cars arrived. 3 of them, lights flashing but sirens off, pulled into the gravel lot with a deliberate slowness that made the onlookers freeze in place. Glenmore was the kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked, where the biggest scandal in the past decade had been a high school prank involving toilet paper and the mayor's front lawn. Uniformed officers stepped out, followed by 2 detectives in plain clothes, one of whom was holding a folder thick with papers. Sheriff Carson, a broad-shouldered man with a perpetually furrowed brow, led the group toward the church. He said nothing to the crowd, only nodded briefly, his expression unreadable. Inside, the air grew still. The few members of the choir still packing up their music sheets watched in silence as the officers walked past them. One of the detectives knocked once on Pastor Merrin's office door before opening it. What followed was surreal. Quiet words exchanged, a few nods, and then Pastor Merrin stepped out. His hands were already outstretched, as though anticipating the handcuffs. His face remained calm, the same gentle expression he wore during communion as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. Gasps filled the church. Some people cried out. Others clapped their hands to their mouths. One elderly woman fainted. The officers said nothing as they escorted the pastor down the aisle he had walked every Sunday for 20 years. The stained glass window behind the altar cast colorful light onto the floor, painting the scene with an almost sacred absurdity. Outside, the murmurs became an uproar as the congregation surged forward, some demanding answers, others pleading for mercy. The sheriff held up a hand and said only one sentence, "There will be a statement later." And then they were gone. In the hours that followed, Glenmore turned into a town suspended in disbelief. The local diner, usually bustling with post-church brunchers, sat half empty, the waitress staring at the door as though expecting someone to come in and tell her it had all been a mistake. At the church, Deacon Matthew Clark did his best to calm the remaining members, but his voice shook, and he kept wiping his glasses even though they were already clean. The news spread quickly, reaching even the outlying farms by dusk. By evening, the town's Facebook groups were a frenzy of speculation, grief, and conspiracy. Some believed it was a mistake. Others whispered darker theories, some ridiculous, others chillingly plausible. That night, Glenmore barely slept. In the county jail, Pastor Merrin sat alone in a cell, his hands resting in his lap. The cell was clean, stark, and cold. He had declined a lawyer, at least for now, and had answered the detective's questions with measured honesty. Yes, he understood the charges. No, he would not resist them. Yes, he had known this day might come. Back in town, Sarah Miller couldn't stop shaking. Sarah was one of the church's youth counselors, a soft-spoken woman in her late 20s with kind eyes and a nervous laugh. She had grown up in Glenmore, had attended the Church of New Light since she was a child, and had looked up to Pastor Merrin like a second father. But for weeks now, she had felt the growing weight of something terrible, something she hadn't dared to name until it had burst into the open that morning. She had been the one to contact the authorities, not because she wanted to, not out of vengeance or anger, but because, after what she had seen, what she had read, she couldn't not act. The day she found the journal, hidden behind a stack of theology books in the pastor's study, her world had cracked. She hadn't meant to snoop. She had been tidying up after a late-night youth group session, putting books back on the shelf, when one fell open and the journal tumbled out. Bound in worn leather, its pages filled with neat, looping handwriting that at first seemed benign, but the entries were strange. At first cryptic, then increasingly disturbing. Mentions of corrections, of confessions extracted, of spiritual penance that seemed more violent than redemptive. Names were referenced, initials at first, then full ones. She recognized some of them. At first, she had tried to rationalize. Maybe it was fiction, notes for a sermon, a dream journal, but the dates matched real events, private counseling sessions, church retreats, even confessions made in confidence. Something inside her shifted that night. Fear bloomed in her chest like an ink stain. She stayed up all night rereading the journal, taking photographs with her phone, and finally, crying silently, she had called the sheriff's department. She hadn't told anyone, not even her fiancé, Thomas. And now it was out. The news stations picked it up by Monday. The headlines varied in tone but were uniformly scandalous. Beloved local pastor arrested in alleged abuse scandal. Shock in small town. Pastor accused of crimes against parishioners. The networks dispatched vans to Glenmore, parking them outside the church like vultures. Reporters tried to interview anyone they could, former choir members, Sunday school teachers, even the local grocer who had once sold the pastor his weekly groceries. Everyone had something to say, but no one really knew anything. Inside the church, the walls echoed with silence. By Tuesday, more names began to surface. People who had long since moved away. People who, until now, had stayed silent. One by one, they began to call the sheriff's office, some emboldened by the news, others shaken into reluctant confession. A picture began to form, fragmented, horrifying, but increasingly undeniable. The charges against Pastor Merrin multiplied. The investigation widened. What had once seemed like an impossibility was now a dark tapestry of deceit and suffering that stretched back over a decade. But still, some refused to believe it. A portion of the congregation gathered outside the jail, praying for Pastor Merrin's release. They held signs that read, "Innocent until proven guilty" and "Stand with Pastor Elijah." Others accused the town of betrayal, claiming the devil had found his way into their midst by turning them against their shepherd. The town hall was forced to schedule an emergency meeting after threats were made against some of the alleged victims. Tensions frayed like old rope. Neighbors stopped speaking. Friends unfriended each other. The very fabric of Glenmore began to unravel, and through it all, Pastor Merrin said nothing. He sat in his cell, quietly reading from a worn Bible, his fingers running across the pages like they were braille. The guards spoke of his calm demeanor, how he never raised his voice, never asked for special treatment. But there was something in his eyes, they said. A darkness, not wild but controlled, like a fire that had learned how to smolder without smoke. When asked why he had written what he did in the journal, he only replied, "I wrote what I believed was necessary." No one could decide what that meant, and as the week drew to a close, the question loomed over Glenmore like a storm. What else had been hidden in the walls of that church? The second week after Pastor Merrin's arrest began with the rain. It hadn't rained in Glenmore for nearly a month, and when it finally did, it came not in gentle spring sprinkles but in heavy, pounding sheets that soaked the sidewalks, clogged the gutters, and turned the gravel road outside the jail into thick, clinging mud. Some in town said it was a sign, divine wrath or cleansing, depending on which side of the fence they stood. Others just shook their heads, their nerves too frayed to attach meaning to weather anymore. Inside the sheriff's office, tension was mounting. Sheriff Carson had known Merrin for over 20 years. He had once stood beside him as the pastor baptized his son in the icy waters of Bell River. They'd shared coffee at the diner, grieved at funerals together, celebrated births and weddings. The allegations had shaken the sheriff on a level he wasn't prepared for, but the evidence was stacking up. Sarah Miller's discovery had cracked the surface, and now the floodwaters were rising. 3 more journals had been found, hidden in an old lockbox buried behind a false panel in the church's basement. Each one contained entries as detailed and damning as the first: dates, names, descriptions of ritual corrections. It was meticulous, deliberate, and deeply disturbing. The details weren't just psychological. Physical injuries had been documented, bruises written off as accidents, scars passed off as childhood mishaps. Some entries described young parishioners being isolated for intensive prayer sessions that lasted hours. Others hinted at exorcisms conducted without parental consent or church board knowledge. Nothing outright illegal on its face, not until patterns emerged. It was the patterns that disturbed the district attorney the most. Then the interviews began. The former youth member who had left town 10 years ago now lived in Chicago. Her voice cracked when she spoke over the phone, and she demanded anonymity, but she remembered the room of stillness, the windowless storage space behind the altar where Pastor Merrin had told her to pray away the anger. She was 13. She had never told anyone because she'd convinced herself it hadn't been abuse until now. Another man, now in his 30s, came forward. He remembered late-night sessions at the parsonage. Scripture conditioning, Merrin had called it. Hours of repetitive verses, eyes closed, Merrin's hand resting heavily on his shoulder. The man had repressed most of it, he said. But reading the entries online, now leaked and circulating in dark corners of social media, unlocked a chain of memories that made him physically ill. And yet, the town was still divided. On Wednesday, the protest signs changed. Now there were 2 camps outside the jail, one demanding justice for the victims, holding candles and photographs, their silence speaking volumes. The other held Bibles, quoting from Romans and shouting about witch hunts and betrayal. Some wept, some raged, but no one seemed able to leave. The space in front of the jail became a kind of twisted town square, a place where grief, loyalty, and accusation collided like tectonic plates. Meanwhile, the church sat shuttered and quiet, guarded by police tape and flanked by state investigators who treated it like a crime scene. Inside, they found more than journals. A small room, undisclosed on blueprints, was discovered behind a false wall in the vestry. Inside, a wooden chair with leather straps, worn hymnals with passages underlined in red, and a filing cabinet full of handwritten evaluation forms labeled with initials. No one knew who had built the room. Merrin had been the only pastor since the church's renovation in 2002. When questioned, he did not deny the room's purpose. It was for healing, he said. The town council called an emergency town hall. Held in the high school gym, the place was packed to the walls. Reporters were banned, but their presence was felt anyway. News helicopters circling overhead, long camera lenses poking through cracked windows. On stage, the mayor, a weary woman named Janice Laurel, pleaded for calm. Her voice trembled as she read from a prepared statement, emphasizing that the investigation was ongoing, that no one was being presumed guilty or innocent, and that everyone deserved their day in court. But it wasn't enough. From the crowd, someone shouted, "How long did you know?" Another voice, louder, more accusing, "Why didn't you protect our children?" The dam broke. Accusations flew at the church board, at the council, at each other. Long-held resentments burst into the open. Families that had worshipped together for generations now stood on opposite sides of the gymnasium, glaring, shouting, grieving. The meeting ended in chaos. That night, Sarah Miller sat alone on her back porch, a glass of wine in one hand and her phone in the other. Her voicemail was full: reporters, strangers, death threats. Some accused her of fabrication, others thanked her through sobs. She felt none of it, just numb. When she looked up at the stars that night, she remembered the first time she met Pastor Merrin. She had been 11. Her mother had just died. Merrin had sat beside her during the funeral, his hand on her shoulder, whispering words of comfort. He had seemed like a pillar, a rock in the storm. But now that memory felt poisoned, or worse, false. Like the comforting presence had been a mask hiding something else entirely. Thursday brought new revelations. Detectives unearthed financial records showing private transfers from church funds to unnamed recipients. Over $80,000 in the past 5 years. Some traced to out-of-town clinics. Others untraceable. The church treasurer claimed ignorance. Merrin refused to speak on the matter. The DA hinted at potential conspiracy charges, suggesting someone else may have helped cover things up. The church's assistant pastor, a young man named Daniel Kraus, resigned abruptly. He released a statement claiming he'd had no knowledge of any wrongdoing, but the timing raised eyebrows. Investigators quickly issued a subpoena for his communications. More victims came forward, and with them, more pain. One was a boy, now 17, who had left the youth group only months before. His story was heartbreaking, subtle emotional abuse laced with control and isolation. Pastor Merrin had made him feel special, then guilty, then terrified. There were no marks, no physical scars, but the boy's eyes told the truth. By Friday, the town's sense of identity had collapsed. For decades, Glenmore had prided itself on unity, faith, and resilience. But now, even those words felt tainted. People no longer greeted each other on the street. The local paper ran blank pages with black borders, an editorial protest against the silence that had allowed this to happen. An old man smashed the church's sign with a crowbar. Another group gathered to rebuild it. And still, Pastor Merrin remained in his cell. The court denied bail, citing the possibility of witness tampering. Merrin's lawyer, a defense attorney from out of town, argued for religious persecution. The judge didn't buy it. "This isn't about faith," she said. "It's about accountability." Saturday morning brought something no one expected. A confession, typed, printed, mailed to the sheriff's office in an envelope with no return address. It was 5 pages long and signed by Pastor Merrin. The confession was chilling in its clarity. He admitted to certain spiritual interventions that crossed boundaries. He described his role as both shepherd and scourge, a tool, he claimed, for God's will to purge darkness. He didn't use the word abuse. He didn't show remorse in the way most people understand it, but it was enough to add fuel to the fire. Enough to shift the narrative for those still holding on to denial. The sheriff released the confession publicly Sunday afternoon. It went viral within hours. That night, someone set fire to the church. It happened just after midnight. A Molotov through the back window. By the time the fire trucks arrived, half the sanctuary was in flames. The stained glass windows melted, the pews collapsed, the pulpit blackened and fell. Investigators would later say it was arson, though no one claimed responsibility. The blaze was visible for miles. Some watched from their porches. Others wept. Others cheered silently. Sarah Miller stood among the crowd as the fire raged. The heat was unreal. The building she had spent her life inside, singing, praying, believing, was vanishing in the smoke. And for the first time since the arrest, she felt something other than fear. She felt release. But the story wasn't over. As the church burned, the investigators found something beneath the floorboards of the sanctuary, an old lockbox welded into the concrete. It would take days to open it. When they did, they would find more journals and a video. But that, they said, would come out in court. And so the town waited, bruised, broken, still uncertain what to believe, and afraid of what truths were still hidden beneath the ashes. The morning after the fire, Glenmore woke to the smell of smoke and silence. The air was thick with it, not just the scent of burnt wood and melted glass, but the kind of silence that follows a scream too loud for the body to hold. The Church of New Light was gone, reduced to a shell of blackened beams and ash-covered pews. Where once the cross had stood, pointing toward the sky, only scorched metal remained, bent and twisted like a question mark. By Monday, a perimeter was drawn around the ruins. Investigators combed through the debris in respirators and gloves. They moved cautiously, digging through decades of sermons, weddings, funerals, all reduced now to ashes. It didn't take long before someone struck metal beneath the pulpit's foundations. A steel lockbox, rusted at the corners but sealed tight, was embedded deep in concrete, welded as if someone never wanted it opened. It took hours to extract it. When they finally pried it open, what they found deepened the wounds of Glenmore beyond what anyone could have imagined. Inside were 6 journals, all written in Merrin's familiar looping script, each one dated and categorized, not by year, but by name. The names matched some of the earlier victims. Some matched people who had never come forward. One of the names belonged to a girl who had died by suicide in 2014. Until now, no connection had been made, but the journal pages told a story too painful to deny. Along with the journals, there was a flash drive. The detectives didn't review the contents immediately. The DA demanded protocol. The flash drive was logged, duplicated, and analyzed under supervision. And then, a week after the fire, they watched it. What they saw changed everything. The video was dated March 2019. The timestamp confirmed it had been recorded in the hidden room behind the vestry. The grainy footage showed a young man, possibly 15 or 16, seated in the wooden chair found weeks earlier. Pastor Merrin stood beside him, reading scripture in a low, steady voice. What followed was not physical violence, at least not visibly, but psychological manipulation. The boy was crying, repeating phrases that Merrin prompted. "I am broken. I must submit. Pain purifies." The video lasted only 27 minutes. It was enough. The boy in the footage was later identified. He lived 2 states away now, estranged from his family, battling addiction and recurring nightmares. When authorities contacted him, he agreed to testify. That video, coupled with the journals and testimonies from over a dozen individuals, formed the spine of the case against Merrin. The trial date was set for mid-August, but Glenmore was already unraveling. By the time court proceedings began, nearly half the original congregation had left town. Property values plummeted. A few families who had fiercely defended Merrin in the early weeks quietly relocated, embarrassed or unwilling to face the judgment of neighbors. The town's once thriving Sunday market lost foot traffic. The diner closed. The mayor resigned. People stopped talking in grocery aisles. Old friendships eroded in silence. In the courtroom, Merrin appeared thinner, paler. He wore no collar now, just a gray suit and a blank expression. He never once looked at the witnesses. Not when Sarah Miller took the stand and spoke. Her voice steady, but her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. Not when the boy from the video described, in halting language, the night he begged to leave and was told by Merrin that only through suffering can the soul be cleansed. Not even when his own sister, Lydia, testified that, as children, Merrin had once locked her in a closet and made her recite verses for hours after she'd lied about skipping school. Merrin's defense tried everything. They claimed the journals were misinterpreted, that Merrin's spiritual practices had been exaggerated by those who now sought fame or retribution. They tried to suppress the video, calling it uncontextualized spiritual therapy, but the judge allowed it. And when the verdict came in, guilty on 17 counts, including unlawful imprisonment, coercion, child endangerment, and emotional abuse, no one in the courtroom moved. No cheers, no cries, just silence. Merrin showed no emotion as the sentence was read. 32 years in state prison without the possibility of parole for at least 20. He simply bowed his head. One of the officers later said it looked almost like he was praying. In the weeks that followed, Glenmore tried slowly, painfully, to find its footing again. The Church of New Light would not be rebuilt. That much was certain. The town council, after weeks of debate and public input, voted unanimously to turn the plot into a memorial garden, a place not to forget what happened, but to ensure it was never repeated. Local carpenters volunteered to build benches. A sculptor from a nearby town offered to donate a piece, an open Bible, cracked down the middle with words carved in the stone beneath it. Truth does not fear the fire. Sarah Miller was asked to speak at the dedication. She almost said no. The nightmares had finally begun to fade, and she wanted to move on. But in the end, she stood beneath the cloudless September sky, surrounded by townspeople she barely recognized anymore, and she told the truth. She spoke of love twisted into control, of how authority without accountability becomes danger, and how silence is the accomplice of harm. Her voice didn't shake this time. The boy from the video sat in the front row. After the speech, he approached her and asked if she'd ever thought about leaving Glenmore for good. She smiled, not sad, not bitter, just tired. "Every day," she said, "but I also think about staying because someone has to." Not everyone stayed. The sheriff retired 2 months after the trial. He never gave a formal statement. The assistant pastor, Daniel Krause, moved to Oregon and was never heard from again. Some of the congregation formed a new church under a visiting preacher. Others gave up religion altogether. Faith, for them, had become indistinguishable from fear. Merrin never appealed. He remained in prison, reportedly teaching Bible study classes to fellow inmates, though the prison chaplain later noted that attendance was low. "They don't trust him," the chaplain said. "Not because he was a pastor, because he doesn't speak with repentance. He speaks with authority, like he's still on the pulpit." 2 years later, Sarah opened a counseling center on the outskirts of Glenmore. Funded by grants and donations, it offered free therapy, legal aid, and community education on trauma and abuse. She called it the Still Room, a name reclaimed from the place so many had once feared. On the walls, she hung local art. There were no crosses, no pulpits, just quiet, open space, and so Glenmore endured. Scars remained. They always would. The church bells would never ring again, but the town no longer needed them to count its losses. It had learned to measure healing not in hymns, but in hard conversations and shared accountability. Parents paid closer attention. Teachers listened differently. Trust was not given freely anymore, but earned and earned slowly. On the third anniversary of the trial, a small gathering met in the memorial garden. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just candles, photos, and silence. Among them stood Sarah. She held a single white flower, set it beneath the sculpture, and whispered a name, not Merrin's, not hers, but a child's name, one of many written in a journal no longer hidden. A name that deserved light. And then she walked away, the wind cool on her face, the town behind her quiet, not with fear, but with the peace that comes, finally, when the truth is known.